This week I'll be showing you how I make these miniature store jars from beginning to end. I don't think I've made a pot that's caused quite so many people to inquire about them before, and I was genuinely blown away by the response to these when I first shared them on Instagram. And whilst they may practically be almost useless due to their size, there is something very covetable and precious about them, especially with their lids that fit so satisfyingly into the narrow openings. They are sort of the kind of pot I'd like to purchase from other makers, as they're small, almost sculptural objects that I could see living very happily on my mantelpiece or on a shelf. So, whenever I make lidded vessels, I always begin by making the bodies of the jars. In this case, each one will be thrown from 150 grams of clay, with an opening on each of 3.9 centimeters. By making the opening the same on each, I can simply throw dozens of lids afterwards, which are all identical, as opposed to measuring each lid specifically for each jar, a process that would very quickly become monotonous. So I prefer to do it this way. Even if there are some limitations, it certainly speeds the throwing process up, and really, the lids that I'm going to be making are sort of just thick, blank canvases, thrown thicker and wider than need be. This way I can trim each lid to match the jar it sits upon, without having to worry about getting the measurements right as well. I keep these weighed out, wedged lumps on a sheet of plastic, which I lightly spray with water so they stay nice and soft throughout the throwing session. My aim when making these is to throw each one different from the last. Different shapes made up from different planes, angles, steps and edges. Some will have wide bases and others more narrow, and absolutely no curves, save for the slight concave surface hole trim on the very top of the lid. But that will get flooded with glaze and will fire flat anyway, so that doesn't count. It can be tricky throwing with smaller lumps of clay. You end up using far less of your hands, relying on just the fingertips for most of the work, and if this isn't something you're used to, it can be tricky to adjust, but fundamentally, everything stays the same. The way I pull up the walls, for instance, the tip of my finger is simply being used in the exact same way my knuckle would be otherwise, if this was a larger lump of clay. Once the rough shape's there, I scrape away much of the slip off the outside form, which I do by pressing the clay out from the inside against the sharp edge of this brass kidney, although in this case I felt the top part needed to be collared in just a tiny bit more, and then I can indent the rim, creating a gallery of sorts into which the lid will slot. And it's this part that I measure to be exactly 3.9 centimeters wide. The body of the jar is given a quick tidy up, and I've switched to a smaller, sharper metal tool, which really helps to create lovely straight, smooth surfaces. And before it's removed from the wheel, I do one last check with the calipers just to make sure the opening's correct. I then slide a twisted metal wire underneath and lift the jar away. There's a few that are similar, but for the most part, each is different, and they're lifted away easily as I dry the palms of my hands in combination with scraping away all the slip off the exterior shape. This way, when I pick the pot up, neither part really sticks to the other. Beyond this, the twisted metal wire that I use really helps, as it creates a more serrated slice that's much less likely to stick back to itself after the wire has passed through. And lastly, if you look carefully, at the exact moment that I lift the pot off the wheel, I also spin the wheel. This helps the pot detach as it twists off in my hands. Throwing the bodies of these is the fun part, as I search for new shapes when making these, whereas the lids, the throwing at least, isn't the interesting part, as essentially I'm going to be throwing 25 of the exact same shape. Although there are a few things I do to make the process slightly less painful, but I'll get onto that in a moment. Instead, the first thing I do is invert the calipers so that they measure 3.9 centimeters, but from the inside, as compared to from the outside. And for each lid, for ease, I'm using more clay than necessary. 70 grams in total, which is a large enough piece of clay to actually throw comfortably. As if you start using less than this, you really should be throwing off the hump. In fact, I really should. But I prefer the pinpoint accuracy I can achieve when throwing directly on the wheel head. Now, the other thing I do with these, to make the throwing faster, is I throw them rough. All I really care about is getting the measurement right so they slot into the openings of the jars. which means that everything else can be left a bit messy. As I'm going to be trimming these a lot anyway, I may as well do most of the tidying up at the turning stage, when it can actually be finalised, as opposed to wasting time now fussing over work I'm ultimately going to be trimming away. The lids themselves are simple. They're a flat disc which I open up in the middle, and then I split the outer wall into two parts: the vertical flange, which is the part that will slot inside the jar, and the horizontal flange that will sit atop it. And for those of you wondering, yes, I'm throwing this upside down, which is something you very commonly do when making lids for pottery. Now, whenever I'm making lids, I always throw a few more than I need, as if I do happen to ruin or drop one of these, I'll have another to replace it. When throwing such small objects, often the process of sliding the wire underneath the lid can distort it slightly, and so this is how I make them flat again. Although I soon realised it might be better if I wire them off the following day, after the really soft clay is dried out somewhat. And with all the components now thrown for the jars, I'll let these pieces sit out overnight to gradually firm up as the moisture leaves them, changing into a state called leather hard, and it's then that the parts can be trimmed to fit together. The first thing I do the next morning is wire off all the lids. I brace the back against my knee, and then I slide a very fine, sharp metal wire underneath them. And yes, there was definitely less distortion in the form when doing it at this later stage. I then flipped all the thrown bodies of the jars onto their rims. This way their bases, which are usually a bit softer, can dry out to be more or less the same consistency as the rest of the pot. As ideally, as I want these parts to fit together really well, when trimming them, I want both the lid and the body of the jar to be the exact same texture. If one part is much softer when I trim them to fit, as they dry out thereafter at different rates, the parts can actually end up not fitting so well. So I'm really careful monitoring the parts to make sure they are the right condition. And if that means wrapping up the lids in plastic for a while to halt the drying process, then so be it. Now, the lids themselves don't actually fit, but that's something I do purposefully, as I'd rather have too much material to work with, as it means I can always turn the lids to fit perfectly, compared to say I threw them to be exactly 3.9 centimeters wide, as that leaves me with very little room for error. So, typically speaking, when I'm making lids, if I need to make something that's 3.9 centimeters wide, I'll actually throw it to be about 4 or 4.1. This way I can trim the locating flange to slot perfectly inside the jar. And that takes things into account like the clay moving and distorting slightly as it dries on both the lid and the body of the jar. Clay isn't static. It can move and bend and unwind as it dries, changing the shape of the opening or making it slightly oval, so it's just safer to work with extra material to account for any of these changes. With the lid trimmed to fit, I can begin work on the body. And these small pots honestly don't need too much work. They were thrown relatively thinly anyway, but again, trimming on a smaller scale like this comes with its own difficulties. The vessel itself and the lid, due to how light they are much more likely to be pushed off the wheelhead if excessive force is used, and that means using smaller turning tools is generally the better option, as applying pressure from a smaller point of contact means less force is used and the delicate components are less likely to be shoved off centre. For a long time, I think I was making the lids of my store jars slightly too thick and heavy, especially on the smaller scale. I was scaling the overall object down, but I don't think the lids were quite right, and I think that was partly why I was so happy with this latest batch of small lidded jars. As I finally nailed the lids, their proportions and their weight feel great. But unlike my larger lidded jars, which have lids that are very good at holding themselves in place due to their weight, these are the opposite of that, and despite them fitting very snugly into the opening, it really doesn't take a lot for them to flip off, or for the pressure of the tool pressing in from the outside to cause them to leap up and out of their restraints. So, all in all, this was a very controlled process. With the lid finished, I then turned the rim and shoulder of the jar. This is something I always do after the lid, as when turning the lid atop this part of the pot, if this section has already been trimmed to be very thin, then the pressure needed to hold the lid down in place as I work can sometimes be enough to cause this section to buckle and collapse, so it's always done afterwards. I then separate the jar from the wheel by sliding a sharp metal knife underneath it. Any leftover material on the wheel head is scraped away, and then I can use the lid of the jar like a tiny chuck to hold the body in place as I trim the bottom. And this, I think, is the hardest part of the process, as even with the lid pinned in place with 3 lumps of soft clay, the whole assemblage can wiggle and move around rather a lot, simply due to how light the body is, especially with this shape, as the base overhangs quite a lot, and although it might not look like it, the fingers of my left hand are pressing down really firmly, as otherwise the pot would just dislodge or tip to one side as it spins. The lid itself is then tidied up, any burrs of clay are removed, and any scuffs or marks left over from where the rim of the jar might have rubbed against it are flattened and smoothed again. Basically, there's a lot of back and forth in the making of these, as practically every surface is trimmed, and I want every surface to be pristine and neat, thin and light, and on this macro scale, everything just becomes far more fiddly, and mistakes just occur more easily, I think. Despite being tricky objects to make, I really love this process. I'm a potter who prefers the trimming stage over the actual throwing of these objects. It's the part where my pots really come to life, I think. The geometric, almost architectural shapes are created, and I suppose I sort of think about it like turning wood or metal on a lathe, which are processes where you start out with a thicker, chunkier piece of material, which is then gradually trimmed back into a much more refined and detailed shape, ones that would really be quite difficult to achieve at the throwing stage alone. After these pots have turned bone dry, the colour lightening and the vessels themselves becoming obscenely fragile, they're all carefully packed into the electric kiln for a bisque firing to 1000 degrees Celsius. This chemically changes clay into ceramic, a material that's much harder and stronger, and perhaps most importantly at this stage, porous. At this point, if I was unhappy with any of these pots, they could simply be turned back to a sludge by slaking them down in water, spreading the slurry onto a plaster bat, which then dries the clay out, and then it can be recycled back into usable clay by kneading it all up. But after this firing, that can no longer happen. The clay can no longer be recycled easily, so I only fire pots that I'm happy with, which means if I somehow identify a vessel I don't like, it's better to simply smash and recycle it at this stage, as after this firing, there's no going back. These electric kilns can be fired automatically overnight, and a few days later, once it's cooled down from 1000 degrees back to ambient room temperature, the kiln can be unpacked. The pots have once again lightened in colour, and they've also shrunk a tiny bit, as this stoneware, from when it's freshly thrown to finally glaze fired, which will be the firing after this, will shrink about 12%, which means my miniature jars will get even smaller after being fired to 1290 degrees. The rest of these were fired in a second kiln load, and I packed these as densely as possible to make each firing more cost effective. The pots themselves can be touching at this stage, as at 1000 degrees the clay doesn't melt or stick to itself, nor does the material get plastic enough for the shapes to distort if they are piled up or placed at strange angles. Although the stoneware at this point is still relatively fragile, and if I were to squeeze a pot particularly hard, it would just shatter and snap. So you have to be careful about how you handle bisqueware, as it still is relatively easy to damage. The next step is the waxing, and for many of these, I gave their insides a quick scrub with a sponge on a stick, just to remove any tiny burrs of clay I forgot to get rid of previously. It happens. As for the waxing, I want to coat the underside of the lid, the rim of the jar, and the base of the pot. I use a very simple wax emulsion, which I thin out a bit with some boiling water, which helps it brush on more smoothly. And this wax, once dry, will stop the glaze adhering to these areas, as well as making tidying up the shapes a bit easier after they've been glazed. Essentially, you can sort of think of the pots at this stage as being like a sponge. When they're dipped into the glaze, the water is absorbed into them, and the raw materials that are suspended in the water, which cannot be absorbed into the body due to their size, instead adhere to the surface of the pot. Over the next couple of days, the water itself will evaporate, leaving a soft, powdery layer of raw materials such as whiting, feldspar, china clay, red iron oxide, and all manner of things on the outside of the vessel. And it's this which, when heated to a hotter temperature, melts and creates the glaze. which means the water itself is really just a form of transport. Although if your glaze is thicker, obviously a thicker layer of glaze adheres to the pot, and if it's more diluted and thin, only a watery layer can adhere to the vessel. So achieving the right viscosity for your glazes is crucial. The ones I use have to go on thick. I dip the pots in, submerging them for a couple of seconds, and then carefully lift it out, rotating it so the glaze flows off and settles in an even layer. The lid is then dipped, flipped, and then brought out in such a way that excess glaze is caught in the concave surface I trimmed on the top of them. With these small angular shapes, I find I can achieve a much more even surface on the outside if I dip them like this, instead of simply dunking the entire vessel at once. I'll then wait a day or two before filling them up with glaze, swirling it about, and then pouring it out. It is a bit slower, but the results are more consistent, and ultimately, with the glazes I use that are so simple, consistency is key. As if there's any irregularities in the surface, say a thin spot or a thick spot, it'll show. So I try my best with all the shapes I make to glaze them in such a way that the most even surface is achieved, even if that does convolute the process, making it longer or adding more steps. Now, the reason I have to wait a number of days between glazing the outside and the inside is because the walls of clay get saturated with water in between dips. So for instance, with this white pot, if I had just glazed the outside, waited 10 minutes and then poured glaze on the inside, as the porous walls were already saturated with water, when the glaze is poured in the inside, as the walls aren't porous due to how saturated they are, the glaze won't adhere in a thick enough layer. So it's crucial to wait a couple of days in between doing this. Although this time is dependent on the weather too, of course. After this, each component is tidied up, and it's this which is probably the most time-consuming part of the process, as even though these parts of the pot were waxed, as my glaze goes on so thickly, sometimes the glaze can cling onto it still, so all of this has to be carefully wiped away, and it's now that I make the edges really pristine, such as where the clay meets the glaze. I want these lines to be very crisp and even, and it's worth spending time making them neater at this stage, as the better they look now, the better they'll look once fired. Throughout this process, I work over a basin of water that catches much of the glaze dust. It's also where I rinse out the sponge used to scrub away most of the glaze with, and eventually, this basin of glaze can be recycled back into the larger buckets you saw at the start. I let the heavier glaze particles settle, and then I pour off the excess water, and then I sieve the leftover glaze back into the larger container. The bottoms of these pots are given a really thorough clean too, as if there's glaze left on the underside of these when they're placed and fired inside the kiln, this will melt, forming a bead of glass that sticks the pot firmly onto the kiln shelf, with the only way of removing it often being by smashing it off with a hammer, destroying both the pot and potentially damaging the kiln shelf, which is definitely the worst of the two evils. The rims are the trickiest part, and I found that the easiest way to clean them up is by very carefully centering them as to not damage the glazed surface of the pot, and then I use a tiny, damp sponge to fettle away the glaze on this top section. The sponge itself is soaked with water, as if I were to attempt to do this with a dry sponge, it would just stick to the clay and draw the entire pot off centre. Not only that, but this whole process is made more difficult due to a majority of the pots having a very narrow base, which increases the likelihood that it wants to tip to either side. All of this means that this particular process is done very carefully and very slowly, as it's incredibly easy to make a mistake. And with all the pots now tidied up, there's one step left to go before they can be fired, and that's wadding the lids. This is a clay-like material I mix myself in studio from 50% EPK kaolin and 50% coarse alumina hydrate. This creates a highly refractory material, as the melting point of alumina is some 2000 degrees Celsius. And in this case, I use this material to prop the lids up above the jar in such a way that both parts can be fired together without actually touching. This saves space in the kiln, ensures that both parts stay nice and round, and means that the colours of both components match. As if I were to fire the lid and body separately in totally different parts of the kiln, there's a chance they could differ in colour ever so slightly. I roll out long coils of the wadding and then cut them into much smaller bits, and then I press 5 of these beads of wadding onto the wax on the underside of the lid and then press it into place on the body of the jar, making sure that the clay of the lid doesn't come into contact with the rim of the jar, as at this higher temperature, if clay touches clay, there's a chance it can fuse due to all the soluble salts in the feldspar that volatilise during the firing, flashing and colouring the clay red. This wadding mixture dries out very quickly, so I always spray it with water and then stuff some plastic tightly over it before sealing the bucket properly. At long last, the pots are ready to be packed inside my Rohde KG-340 gas kiln. Unlike the Bisque firing, this time the pots that are placed inside cannot touch. Instead, I leave about 2 or 3 millimeters between each, but I still load the kiln as densely as possible to make sure each firing is as cost effective as it can be. It also makes it easier to achieve a proper reduction atmosphere, as there's simply less space for oxygen to occupy. If I were to pack this in such a way that there were lots of big, empty voids, I would have a much more difficult time firing it properly. This means that each kiln load is a bit like a puzzle, and it can take arranging and rearranging a shelf a couple of times before you find the most efficient usage of the space. At the same time, it helps if there's some variation in height, as this creates paths the flames can move through to properly distribute the heat throughout the kiln. And once fully packed, the kiln can be lit with the doors open. This way, excess gas doesn't accumulate in the chamber, which is all then suddenly ignited. The heavy door is then swung closed and sealed tight. In all, this firing takes about 9 hours from beginning to end, and throughout this process I raise the temperature very gradually, as rushing this process can cause pots to explode. For the first few hours I go very slowly, and then from about 300 to 800 degrees I can push it a bit more, which I do by increasing the gas pressure and the air pressure, and any change I make is recorded in my kiln notes. At 860 degrees exactly, the reduction atmosphere is started. I do this by dramatically increasing the gas and air pressure and by sliding a damper over the flue of the kiln. This limits how quickly the exhaust can escape, and simply put, there ends up being too much fuel in the chamber with an insufficient amount of oxygen present for it to burn properly. As a result, the atmosphere inside begins to seek oxygen from inside the clay and glazes themselves, stripping it away, the oxygen bubbling out, changing the iron molecules themselves, and creating colours and textures that you can't really achieve in quite the same way with an electric kiln. And finally, once the top temperature has been reached, some 1290 degrees Celsius, the kiln can be switched off. And I remove the bungs from the spy holes to help the kiln crash cool back down to 1000 degrees Celsius, which helps the glazes retain colour and sheen, after which it's fully closed up, and from this point it takes about 2 days to fully cool down. Two days later, and with the kiln sitting at about 70 degrees Celsius, it's time to unpack. The pots change colour dramatically, the pinks and reds turning into greens and blues through the reduction firing process, and from this point, all the pots are unpacked and the lids of the jars can be carefully cracked off. These usually come off quite easily, but sometimes a speck of iron can fuse to the wadding, pinning it in place, which makes removing them a bit more difficult, but typically with a bit of a twist, they come off. I've collected all of my waddings over the years, and eventually I'll find a way to grind this stuff back up to a fine powder, which I'll then add to the wadding you saw previously, so that it can be recycled. And finally, I use a bit of chemical valve lapping paste to grind the lids smooth. This stuff is only used on bare clay, never the glaze, and it helps to grind away the more coarse specks of grog in the clay body. It can also grind away the clay of the rim, making the lid fit, even if the pot has warped a tiny bit. But most importantly, it makes the lid spin with a glassy smoothness, as compared to spinning quite roughly in place. I don't use new paste for each jar. Instead, I remove it from one piece and spread it onto the next. This makes this carborundum paste last for a very long time, and this process really does make all the difference to the finished pieces. And you can even make lids that don't quite fit, as they're just slightly too big, fit perfectly. With all of the miniature lidded jars ground, the greasy substance is then washed off with hot, soapy water, and at long last, the pots are finished. They're tiny. Impractical, maybe, save for a few keepsakes, but the way I generally use my jars is for pouring things out of. They're filled up with, say, salt or pepper, and then due to how the gallery works, they can be used quite effectively for pouring or sprinkling the contents out. But like I mentioned at the start of this video, due to their size, I think these really are just comfortable, almost sculptural objects, and they may be some of my favourite pots I've made lately. especially their tiny disc-like lids, encrusted with a thick layer of feldspathic crackle glaze on the top. I think with my next batch of these, I'll trim more detailed feet on the bottoms of them, but otherwise I'm really happy with how they turned out, despite them being finicky pots to make. I enjoyed the challenge of making something on this smaller scale. In a way, it links to the video I made last week, which was all about scaling pots up and down, making sure their proportions are right, despite them being smaller or larger, and I think I finally nailed it with these, although, as always, I still think I can do better. If you made it this far, let me know, and thank you, as always, for taking your time to watch. It really does mean the world to me, and it supports my small business more than you know. And I'll see you next week.